We should be able to initiate our last day. I'm actually kind of sad that it's our last day together, but it's going to be good because then you have a few more days of other material that you'll be working with other mentors.
Touchless, and a dealing around the chatty, Nimatamati Chakos, somebody six Jurachi Chakadu, Simbainaya, Niki Shenda Tanya, the answer to la Nature from Sintis, Shenda Juchashenda, Katian, Jumaya race.
And as always, you know, I thank you for this opportunity, and it's such a great honor to really share my passion for biology with everyone. And hopefully, in the last couple of days, we all learned something together. And for our last day together, I want to just begin by reviewing all the different things that we have seen in the last 2 days. And like I said before, I actually did more research on the cavefish, so I have a bit more information on this particular story.
Is catfish or what they call a shinjutis, Tinsapuji, Stambalaya, Tigola, and Nitsumasona, Capsit on Nitsumasona, Juaching to Chayes.
All right, so let's go with our review. So we understand that life, we learned already that it's very diverse, all kinds of different things in our planet. Most of them, if not all, have some type of cyclic rhythm in their lives.
We spoke
about really the function of having such rhythms. A lot of them come from the genetics of an animal, and others come from the environment. And of course, we have to realize that even though we have internal and external cycles, a lot of the cycles that we have in nature are a combination of both external and internal factors. That new conduct nani roanga sule kori shila teba ta kori na la tewa choro shini chepa ta nani chepa mambu choro atin stambalaya mambu nani zo de nga su yang ko chen jin jong chen la ta bai ba da shi ge chen ta yang nang ge chen su ro ta ni chala ta ni jong ta res. And just to review from the last 2 days of class, why is it so important that animals and living things have cyclic rhythms such as circadian clocks? Why is it that we have them? And anyone in the room can answer.
Gechingaranjin de Kanadojinas, Karichini said de Gala, nature so lens on your lenches on Ronans, Susan Albius, land.
And anyone can raise their hand and they can just tell us why they're so important. Anyone in the room?
Masuga Tinzungu Condri or Condri or Tenda, you
you kitchen Rashindiga is the Michigan knowledge. That's
Di zaragi ta tuzi khode de yobe na ane dila kebendoji ane susu ngirege chasha tine tuptan da tisere ta kebendoji yores ta di.
yeah, it benefit our day-to-day activities, daily
Absolutely.
activities.
Absolutely. And thank you for the answer. And yes, it's certainly day to day. It could be season to season, or it could be even, year to year.
Arrangeres le no vale tu ci standard ci sono ci na re sha sha wa ni ma re sha sha la ya ne ku kipen triore te na sha nga su ti tri ro nam ti gi kap se nam ti ma ro kap su ti gi sha sha la ya shu chen ku kipen triore te me se ne lo gi ya sha sha chi ro wa o tu la ya ko kipen triore
It
And
also
really, anyone have any other questions?
no, I'm just adding answer to the question.
Yeah.
So the circadian rhythms keeps balance our biosystem.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely it does. The rhythm keeps all the processes functioning properly in a streamlined, in a flowing fashion, right? And that is very important for the stability of the organism.
nga so lente ga resna nga so chengwe ge chele chi ro chengwe ge chele de na la ya ko ani chanyum ne wa che ta chi tangyum ne wa che ge chele tin dong res tin sta bala ni tela ten de ta nga su ge ta khondri chi ro khondri ko ta khori ngi jin chen ko khori de nga su zu ko na ne chi ta chele de kan za mu tu de ta jun ne ba che la ya pen to chi res.
And I've been thinking about this a lot, even yesterday when I was, not teaching you all, but I was just home, about the different types of rhythms in our bodies.
That okay, so that trippy maybe because in Benanga that non that because in Benang not to Zupu and la you big it, country not what you are, country not what the Tagalaya, some yes.
So we have the circadian rhythm of sleep, awake. That's a fairly straight, fixed rhythm that we can understand.
That picture sharp, and I suge Ninya Taya Sage or what take it to conducting by na, and a coach Niche Yopakanshila, and a Kuala Yanchi Tabduchi race.
But we can also think about, for example, the temperature in our bodies. Throughout a 24-hour cycle, it can fluctuate. At certain times, it goes a little bit lower, and at other times, it can go a little bit higher.
Then I'm singing as a young condu careta yoris and as Libu tricete tires, as Libu tricete, and you might chicken out to use the sugaring Libu tricele tavina, and it captula could Libu tricete this tool here, captula yanko, yanti Libu tricete mouch high to yoris.
We can also think about hunger and thirst, the fact that we feel hungry at approximately the same time of the day each day.
That Shandang also to go toy the Kakomia do the English, Chashap and also to go toya get you toilet or a day by now. Halam also Nima relation to Twitter, Nijin to Nijin Chilaya, and so to go toy is what the English.
And if we sort of think about all these rhythms coming together, they're just a way to stabilize our bodies and to allow the processes, the function of our bodies to work properly.
Tangatsu Tedala Samlich Tamba in Banner or Condin de Tola Samlich Tamba in Banner, Kogut so then as Zopo that Tanyumlas was good at that tempo Tayana, Tanyum new a neighbor like Degchiatan, Tening as Zupoge, Chashi de Taku, Jeguchi Dugugora, Chelichi Dugura, but did Debiati, Aniko, a Tatachi Duvela Yapendocles.
And really, if there is anything I want you all to remember from our 3 days of lecturing on this particular topic, is this, right? That the rhythms, the different types of rhythms provide all kinds of benefits in function and stability for all kinds of organisms.
You may need no longer to take or la, that Corlo tinzun kholu sugura jin kundi ko la kicha mampu chi she wa stan data na ne chetsu ge chigda samlo na tele ta mit ni samna zingu ya ke chishu te kar resa baina ta khondri ta mampu yo res to khondri pe mampu chi wa tan data ka shele so te karin dong go res ne zupo ge chashi te ta chele leka te ko chegu te ta ta dup chi ga ta ane nga su zupo te da zupo nang ge nebab te ta ane ko tembo dang yang na nga su ta tangnyom la su gora chanyombo ngo newe chia la ya pantro chi yo res.
And if we put it into the perspective of today with our pandemic, right? Our bodies would not be able to fight such a detrimental virus if our own bodies were not structured in a way that they worked efficiently.
Ta picha shaba ina nga su tanda gi chi toy na sa tida do ga ta nyen rim tin shu cham ji kha de ro de gi ni kap tida do chi la ya ke de nga su zupo ge ane ko kar su da zupo de ni ba ya pu chi la ni de ten ko gi chele ta ta chi dom ki me ba in ba ina ane tanda gi chi na sa ane yen sing na san tin shu cham ji la ba ina de la ya ane ko che tang dem ba gu su ro ta che phe ga ne ane
So we could imagine if our bodies were infected by the virus, and many people unfortunately ended up dying, but many more would have died if we were unable to fight off such illness, such pandemic.
Mi mambo chita tanda nasa tila tani chong yo re simba ina nga su sipo gyo mo ne tina dawo chila ko chetan demba gani ani ku nasa tila pa kon go tu meba imba ina ani nga su tanda mi chong wa tele chi ma wa chi ani ko chong yo gi res.
And the last point of the review is really, to think about when you have a cycle, you have a lot of different proteins, chemicals, genes working together, and you have to create this map where everything has a correct and efficient flow of function.
Tamate de is nga su nisha chikira tsunsa shina la ya ko ane kondri tenda do mambu yo pa te na la ko chelin doni te mbana nga su tzi yo re de ta mambu chukura toyong re stan de ta toyong ba de ta nga su da ko cheli temba de yang ko kar su re ta tsu ngi chin je la ya ko ge ta ko tanda ge ta ligje da yang na tzi ngi chin ki cheli tomba la ten de ten ko leka te yang ko
So, once again, you could imagine this really complicated map. If you weren't creating this in a controlled fashion, it would not be able to function. There are way too many things playing about.
Kroga nangla ya leka chini chele chini ge chi karsu chele ndongkha ma ta cha ani chi tes chi chu pa imbai na yang ko karsu re da chi yang ne ta ta ma ya ba ta chi ne tong za da ko ne tang tin da cha yo ris kar chi la pa na ko la ya cheshi ma bu chi ke chele tin dong ge cha.
And of course, by regulating such complexity, we can have organisms with less damage and more control within their own bodies.
Ta tira do yin la ro ta nga su tira do ko la ya zu ko na ne ko ta chen jin ta ta ji jin wa le che de ne nga su kar su re ta nga su ne chin de jin wa da ane su bo ga ne kar su re mi chin de jin wa ta ba na ane ko su ge che le de ta ta dong kres.
Are there any questions about anything that we've seen the last 2 days?
Then they will even need rin la ya one for la ya joy or yes. That's all.
Tananganzo gege swege schedule rhythm sentence the tinzu color singing the nganzo dramil yosungora tindi dramil subo nolo chabu pe mambo yora trilli mambo yora tindi schedule rhythm singing the chabu re le yona menas ani chabu re no yona ani chabu gi chashi kandin de jing inzi chewan pena chabu nolo la ta wanta pe mambo yora
Re
ne tindi chi tsiri tone second tento yona mena kandinas.
You have mentioned about circadian rhythm, and I have a question regarding about this. Is associated with the cellular level, if you think about cells, we have like trillions of cells in a body.
Yes.
And each part of the body, each part of the cell, which part of the organelles associated with the circadian rhythm.
Right. And it's very, very complicated. You have to, organize this really set of cells. We have billions, if not trillions of cells. We have to regulate them. We have to control them. We have to organize them. But as we remember, in the brain, there is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which controls, for example, the sleep-wake cycle.
Zupu nangla da tapu masuna da tembe mambu yoris. Da tina ne nga sugi da tangi shepa na shingu kogi da pangre mambu digu duwarwa. Pangre mambu digde tang kuchili tusundang yoris. Tane nga su lepa gana ne chashi di superchiasmatic nucleus tegi ane ko tirwa da di shapong sumbu ina jinsa yu samshi. Dan tokte masong. O di imbai na nga sugi migi da ni kuya tang se yorwa.
And just like we may have that nucleus, that suprachiasmatic nucleus with the sleep-wake, other centers control different cycles. So for example, hunger may have another nucleus which controls hunger or thirst, or other rhythms which are cyclic throughout the day.
당진진이 레비기 딱고 충분스는 리코레 띵영띵다 만라오 유장로와 띵다 유장 아니 비차샤바나 단다기 띵바나 angong기 시스템바가 수 세바당 니당 세된 그런 게 데르도가 고 당진진이도와 아니 디메나 아니 가서그래다 영화 속에 똑바당 껌바치고 왔다 디껌기 그냥 고 대기 얼진텔라양 당진진이고
And by having all these different centers in the body, different genes that are playing together, they're collaborating together, we're able to control all the different kinds of cells within our body. And this is not an easy function within our bodies.
This tambalaya ngasugi detalaten detiro ngasugi jedang zuponangi ko tangzingi ta tenise gora teta mampo chigo nyamle da ani nyamdri ge gane ngasu zupo nange ni khondri detala ani ko tangzin tangchanji chigo res.
All right, so like I promised, I was going to talk a little bit more about back here about the cavefish. This is something that I started giving you some information in the last 2 days.
That the cola kesan shivana shinde tanda the catfish sena kutirwa tapuno the denignashwa or dig cola yet is shigins.
So we remember there is the same species. One lives on the surface, one lives on a cave, and the ones in the cave do not have eyes, even though they have the socket. They have the space for the eye, but the eye is missing.
That team banner ngasuge tege ni rhythm banner chu nano that talk non the bache chu that lo de reswa and ko the non de ni tela ya ko mi yo maris imbana ko mi ki chaki la ya mi ki ta ko zuta do de yo bana ya mi yo maris.
And even though when we compare those two different shapes, the cave and the surface, in the cave, even though there is no light, they still function under some type of circadian cycle.
Ta take up simbana tapon de ni nyate imbana roa kola ya ta mi yo mare mi mestambala sugite wela yo marwa imbaina yang ko ta we me pi ne ba de la imbana yang ko ji khondri ni chin chi la ya ten de de ko ge chawa chi dus.
And what is really interesting is that a lot of the functions of this cave fish, it's not the same as the surface. There are some changes, but some of the traits still follow a 24-hour cycle, but there is a lot of preservation of energy.
That Google Dakars the Chugu candidate is go that Tala Denita Druba in Bainaya Kugi Jetantis Mandorish as Condite Mandorish in Bainaya Kula Condi to a Sena Condidus, Stenting Condidus, Condi Unimen say, and you could digging on a catching and Karila patient to system Balaya Zubon on a
Nuba the near such a chitan picture tang de shas.
So the surface fish throughout different hours may have certain fluctuations in how much oxygen is consumed in response to the amount of light, the temperature of the water, and other things within its habitat.
That gala deni bana tanda diganani automatic delage gala deni tersugro chu kala deni team chu kala deni team stambala kugu zupugi karsugureta to set on ni chugu to set on the nimati yueti kasujira marala tende te kugu zupuna la rabige aninga zu cholonge jiga raig chechigorwa hotela yan jirtondo stugdeshas.
And what is really interesting is the consumption of oxygen with the cavefish is pretty much the same throughout the 24-hour cycle, even though some of those traits in the fish still follow a circadian clock.
Tanga zuge tapuna ni deni ge nyati taw chombai bana koge dan shigring la ya koge ane oxygen yorwa cholong ti koge ta pecho tanga chorwa ti ge chede ane halam tangnyon do chita ko che chi tangnyon do de dus jura shita me pe ne ka de dus imai nan de kap te la ya ane ko asgure nyan de ge tapuna ni deni ge nyan de la ya korong ta che shima sumarwa ane tandanga zuge 콘드 주로 콘드 데라 진데 지역이 제시 요바인 바나야 그거 zupunan ge cholong pecho tangage nebabde jorashira mepi nebala digdus.
So this is a clear benefit to the cavefish as a way to preserve a lot of that energy and use it in other traits such as size, swimming ability, and other traits that do not relate to having the need for light.
다 피셔 샤반에 데도라테네 그런 게다 제시나네 반응아 수게데 미여 발레테네 데 제시 그런 걸 쓰고데 저로 통하다고 당아 지체제한테 도시거로 왔다가 제시 데이터라 쿠비게 니바데 아니 그런 거네 반나 아니 그렇습니다 뉴반 데이터가 되고 미어 처지 가지고로 아니 단들라텐데데 아니 들라텐데던 콜라야 키펜 추천보 용바데 아니 원수도 보데 두스.
And what is really interesting with this particular type of activity is that the scientists that did this performed a type of activity called a garden experiment.
다 고수게 가르치오레스나 디 영화 제가 아니 제구지도레스 제구팀을나야 garden experiment activity.
Yeah, garden experiment, and I'll explain what that is in just a minute.
Sure. Garden activity searches.
So what the researchers did in this particular case is they took samples from the surface, fish from the surface, and fish from the cave, and they switched their habitats. So they put some cave fish in the surface, and they put some surface fish in the cave. So they basically reversed the habitats.
다 고수 가르치오레스나 생각하게 딱시되게 값을 고수 가르치오레스나 냐다 그 땅에 대니티 땅 탁분하는 대니티 니 차기 그런 거 전도게 지 코리시오로 왔지 주자 버리스 올라 탁분하는 대니티 추구 카양 코레 타부 카양 그 기억 받다 타부 칼레 대니티 맞추기 올라 마다 타부가 나만 그 땅 버리스.
And by doing this, don't worry too much about the details, but what they actually tested the genetic activity across the different types of fish across different types of habitats.
한다 대값을 그 삼로 쇼치 땅마고 제 대값이 바나 아니 그게 가서 그래 나 코리 초대고 코리 만다고기 나와야 아니 그속에 양코 제기 챌린지로 아티 만다 카나로 시탄 도세 때라야 타바데스.
So for example, here on the top panel, we have 3 different habitats: the surface, which is right on the surface, exposed to light, and 2 different cave habitats, which are 2 different sort of localities with caves.
다 비슷 당보되는 다바인 바나 가속에 고수 주들 지사고 거의 만들어 섬직부터 지에서 당보된 바나 줄로나 되니레 서페스가 되니레 옛날 바나 가속에 야 잡고인 바 가시다야 잡고게 고 가속에 니 만들어기 잡고니게 너니 뜻이지레스.
So now you can compare surface activity, right, with a true circadian clock according to the light, and the cave habitats in 2 different localities, which even gives you more data for comparison.
Tadana de Imbana Natsuba Chalola ya Dej Tambala Chalola Denity, Chungula Denity Imbana, Kusuela Tempi Natsu Nishoko Kodri de la Yako, the Tengi or what, and a Kogan Lion Jiro Kandas do Data, and a could Tapu Imbana, Tapu and Nila, Roani Mando and Nila, Sani Mando and Nila, your pig Tapuna Maya, your pig Nyat Suraya, could Keprakanda do things Tambala, data Truba Imbana, Masu Dursagi Yanko. This
what is really interesting is if you have the relative comparison of the expression of certain genes between the surface and the two cave fish, well, there is a certain difference between the cave populations and the surface population. And that we expect the surface to essentially be quite different from the caves. But what we do note is that within the caves, even though there is complete darkness, right, we still show a certain flow when it comes to different hours within this cycle, which is very, very interesting.
Chalola Denity Banner resume one and Bana, Coach Lola Degi, or Chinguna Degi, on the coach chapter time, Barajanda, the Druba in Bana. Yeah, Tim said that could talk Nala Degi, your time Bana, who get Nesa Mandola and the Tang and Suge Karsura, that chapter Masuna, this you this Mogodus, the Tinstambala and de Yanko and Nitsigatan Chatting Tenishapa in Bana, Chatin Yanko, Kayan Simbutan, Karsu, and so with the Shas.
Now, mind you, these are very complicated experiments with a lot of different factors, right? But we can visualize the fact that even though cave fish are not exposed to light, the normal sunlight, they still follow, their genes still follow a certain change throughout the hours, which is very, very interesting.
Takshindi nyukta sauji dribiyore tem sedela ishushin teni gischema sona namba mampuchi yores. Ta imba na di kapsa ngasu kare la ya chiga samdutano chi sena ko ta tina rochi yor da imba na ya ko ta chakpuna na deni tegi nya te la chilok nyima go po yo marwa ko meba imba na ya nyima go po meba imba na ya ko ge karsubure ta rigzi la tene de ti ro 아니고 마수게 디수고 컨디션 템비 뭐라다 인샤고 컨디션 템비게 르지게 원놈이 바티 아니 tenyo resting 요치는 리레스.
And what the researchers also did, this is very, very cool, I love reading about this, is that they also took certain fish and they brought them into the lab, not just in the wild, but they brought them to the lab.
다 박세 진이도 가리치오레스나 양코수고 피는 지가 Takunani Tachurani Shama by Bayon Kusunya Kachirua, who's Taxicala and Kion Yoris.
And what is really interesting?
Hello.
Let me know when you're done.
Miguel, there is a question.
Yeah, question, yes.
당연히 지워디 빠진 렌 야구였어요 단다. 이 지워디 가는 있으나 단다. 개피시 아니 단다 거기 tun지 콘도도 냐자 지어서야디 따체리 베니어스고라. 이 따지 사딩 얘기 냐 셴바깔 따지 지에 중요나 가르쳐놓고 개피시 쿠란을 개브나 여데베깔 따지 지에데 데스카고라. 아니 로다 여직 마당나니 통고마라.
네.
tapajin lendi kurang di wade jabgu yosari nge tiwadi sumba rangla ani sane kurang yosala takche cheyagi kogob chungyorbe.
His question is regarding the catfish because when you have mentioned about they preserve some sort of rhythm in the body. Right. His question is the experiment or the activity is down on them while they're alive in their own like natural habitat in the cave.
Yes, absolutely. So what happens is with these type of experiments, I have not worked this on my own in the past, but what I understand is that they collect the populations and they will mark them, and then they will obviously kill the animal and they will examine the genetic activity within the animal.
Te taran chi yoresta chi ti tanda kutsuge ngarang banadan di kapse ko takshigna te shajatan dushi chi me simba na ya selpa kutsuge karchi goresana karsa goreda ta rigje la ya kenchi bi kapse rigje ge ngonam tela ta bi kapse wa kutsuge karchi goresana nyata tizu ko taksachi sa tizu sin sinu jela ya kusula tak jab tak jenu jela ya ane nyati ko se nu jela ni rigje ge
What is really interesting, and I'll tell you a bit of a story. Before coming to Emory, and I see that we have in our presence Dr. Eisen, who is actually my mentor at Emory. Before coming to Emory, when I was looking for postdocs, I actually almost went to study cavefish in Mexico.
Gela koran bana nga so ta tin banam ton san muji la banam ga nyam sok tu su ji yor wa ti ne emory la mayong la ya emory yong ta emory la yong lu jela gen la gi ta thotam ba de gen aire la to gen aire sa la yong chi dus ta banam ga nyam so ti ma chi nge la ya ta Mexico la son de ti ta tok no na yor pi nya ti ga la ya ta shi ji ta ji trap ji wa insta ke te emory la yong ma pa na
So even though I have not studied them on in my research, I find this very, very fascinating. And maybe in the future, I don't know, I could find a way to examine them. But right now, I have not done any work with cavefish.
Tangala tiko gama ya takuna newe ge nya gala ya tashi che ge ku kop taw chong tashi chi yo mare simba na khosu ge ne tan tin na ba na chi yan chen bo dang chi chi tu na chi sa chi le mun chi ge chi chen na maung ba la chi chen na ya ko gala ya tashi chi ya tin da lo jong se ge res.
But what I do know is that the populations that are in the cave, they're actually quite accessible. You can find them easily. You can go into the cave, you just walk right in, you do a little bit of a hike into the cave, and you find the populations of fish, and they're all blind in the cave, and they're very easy to collect.
Tane te garsa ane tanda nga chu chakpun na de ni gi nya de ro yin ba na ro wa ne shi chu ji tsali la yo res ta chakpun la ya chin che ne ko garsa ta chakpun ka ba je de snu ga ki res chin ba yin ba na che la ya che chu ge nya ti nye gi res ta nya ti ge ta de na de ni chakpun de ni nya cha man du sta ko mi yo ma res.
And of course, in a lab setting, which is this other part of the experiment, they were able to emulate cave and surface settings to study with the fish in a lab, which is sort of a artificial way of doing it, not in the wild.
Ta shen da chi nga su ge ya tak she khan la ya yon chi tak she de ko re ten se ko re sta ti kap sim ba na nga su khar chi re se na ne tak ku na la yo pi nya ti chu ki yon nya ki yon de te tak she khan la ya ane tak she khan na khar chi re se na ko ge da ko ge nya ti ko na de sa ge da takpunana depi ta ko rangshongi khoi chi ro kana ro chi ba tena ro chi ta strio reswa tena ro chi tan draw zu de tan te gala ta chi res.
And by doing this, you can examine, for example, between B and C. These are different genes, different markers. You can see that in for example, this gene, the cave fish is completely flat, showing no cyclic activity, but the other marker shows a very different activity.
Ta ti kap sim ba na tanda ni dinda chi wala ten de nga su khari chit ko res na ri gu ngan chen da khat le chit ko res wa picha shana nga su ti kap su pi shin din na pe be dang se na la tan ba na shin ba na pe be na ne tanda ngombo chi ro ngombo de tanda ta ko ti re do pa chu na la de ni ta ko tak na de nya ti kap sim ba na ko ri gu ngan ti kap su ta ri gu ngan sin na ko re zi te la ya ko su marker se go chen ta te ro te la ya ko che pe shi ta me pa ta and I uncle is shenda la yanko and chapter you but chip in the missing to the country ranching you pa they thank those.
And by going what our friend asked before and how complex these cycles are, we're talking about trillions of cells, we're talking about millions of different genes perhaps. I don't really know how many genes, but there are many, many different genes. So it becomes a very complicated process to control.
Ta ngama tanda de la ya ko draw na shi de de ko da dang zin ji la ya ha chen yo ra chen bu ri sna so ge cha phong yin bai na yang cha phong be de tanbram mambu dang tene karsugre rizin bayna ya rizig wanam tene shepana sai mambu chichna tene do yo kre tin tambalaya ne khote da kuge karsugre da tangjin chi ya dang tela tashi chi ya de bayna changma ge da chayong she bayna hachang ge ko nyongzong chaudin da ris.
So hopefully you now have a fairly good idea on how complicated studying cyclic rhythms are. And essentially we can have all kinds of different combinations and different results when it comes to having different environmental inputs in organisms.
That and then by Chechala, Nit and then as to countries and general European countries, such a country data like Osiji by the Katsu, Nyokas Hoji in baggage, and it's you Katsu and the city Levada, and data like country chita year the imbana, country de la yako, switching tea, the Natsukoitan, data attended Mampuchi and Pataya, Zupunanayam, data like a country de Yanko, Nashiki Chepa, my Mampuchi Kasureta, Nyamjita Karsure. That is great. Mampu jiki chen chongala teni jungu yopate ani shitsuge chento yong tukirachi.
And we also learned, just to finish our review, that with this very high complexity, a lot of things can go wrong, right? And one of the results could be, for example, the illness that we spoke about, that we learned about, the fetal familial insomnia illness.
So shenda chinga suge ngola deshi jashayo restati karisevaina matsuga ni kumtubige nasa stogarwa otem baina digiya meton deshi.
Right. So we learned that this is a genetic illness, really rare, and essentially it breaks down the whole cyclic rhythm. Our sleep is disrupted. We start malfunctioning in the bodies. We lose weight. We are not able to balance, and we end up with really, abnormal blood pressure in our body.
This combo is in by Naya, the Zina Sachiris. That team by Nangatsuge, Zukuna Yopic Condrite, that hopper Tadatica Simbana, Niton Seg Condrite, like Action Tigris, Coaction Tegichi, Jitse Chabda, and as Zukote Tunyam Tata them to Barwa, and it attended as to Trachet and Jundema in big Trachet at Dinda among yours.
So you can see here, just like what we saw before, brain activity in a normal brain, our brain without this illness, and a brain that has underwent this illness for many months, right? So you essentially lose a lot of the brain activity and your brain essentially goes to sleep and it stops functioning correctly.
That Tandanim Bana Natsugi, Peridela Bayana, you choked in Bana Natsu Namjingeta. Lepachirwata, Zhotagi short in Bana, Tandag Natsa de Chung de Tanatsa de Chungta, Dawa Mampungo Jurua, Dawa Mampungo by Bana, De Nalaya, Elingasu, Lepin Nangi, Cheko, Mampuchi Labata, and a Koge, Lepin on it, Hopperta, teaching your wrong Asugia, Condri de Laya, Chintegura, Tela, Tenede, and a co Persegure, Lepin Nangi, and Cheguzo. Nyongrugore, that Hamatilla Karchagore, Sananga Suge, Lepate Nikurista, Lepate Jegut and Madambaku, Chelet and Madambaginival Rangeris.
And what is important to remember is that when it comes to illnesses like this one, there is still a lot, excuse me, there is still a lot we do not know, right? We know that this is a really rare genetic illness.
That and then Nathan Denado, Nathan Denado in by Nayangatsuge. Because when they that zig in such a combo switching Bahakuris, in Banan Digitela Yanko and Nathan Mambuching at switching Liomaris.
So we may have an idea of where the mutation is happening. For example, in this case, in chromosome 20 in the PRNP gene, but we may not know the normal function of the gene. We know that there's a mutation, but we may not know the complete function of that gene.
Asu Shia Karshigores and Tede Rizi Kangila Ninju Chimbaro, Rizeti PRMP said Tegerizi Nishibagana Yochuge, Delaya, any Kolaya Ninju Teo Bahaku, Simbana Asu than the PRMP Segi, any Rizichu or Tegi Jele Chats on Hakuyo.
And it is really only through research that we can start digging and getting more information on the process of the genes that we're working with to really understand why is it that mutations in certain genes may cause such detrimental illnesses like FFI.
Da danda tina shingirwa nga suge ta takshe tira doji jebaina takshe da tiji data la takshe jebaina ko chele kanda doji resha ko kangile shuchin tegu doze takshe jebain baina ane kale nga suge ya ko chele cha tsonga shi de da jinsen kare chila teni de tirwa da de la chung kare chi showa la teni de tanda nga suge da rigzi na sa da zata ko rigzi na sa di da FFI sig do ati ko chekyo ba jinsen de ya chichina.
So in many ways, we have to essentially become detectives and really get to the bottom of what causes such illnesses, what the functions are, what are the consequences, and so forth.
Da shuchin kari yo ba chen kari imba tena do zenye da picha shabana nga so chiga namjing gi chui thone ya nyen tok pan do chiga nga so jurbu yores.
Okay, so that brings us to our review from what we have seen in the last two classes. Hopefully by now you have a good understanding of circadian rhythms, their importance, and what happens when they go wrong.
Da de kari sena nga so nyama niwi na jambe ge cherjon chi ins da tande chala ya nge da riwati kari imba sena ne chiga tichu kondri choro ti ha ko tang chele kari imba ane data ke gimpen kari yo ba keching ranshi kari imba ne data la chon shorba imba na ya ko chon ta ko karsure te ge shuchin kari yo ba ko la ya ne consumption shebe ge riwayes.
And for today, for the remaining of today, in our first session and the second session after our break, we're going to be looking at essentially differences within populations when it comes to circadian clocks.
Da tandagi chotan laban data ane chotan niba ni kapsunga su karita ginsena ane karsugureta chiyam chodi manda gi chala ya ane tinjung khondu nang gi chi cheperti kana do chu me data gins.
So, for example, we could take a 24-hour window, right? And we could keep track of a lot of different changes happening within our bodies when it comes to hormonal release, muscle movement, the state of sleep, and so forth.
menzi di logi pa ta ani chi te ta na sing ge karsugre da zupo ge da karsugre ti shadim ge kungu che ta la so pa ge yong ko kange la che tu yo pa da kange che ma yo pa sugura ta te ge la ya nga so ta gins.
So for example, the two things I would like to point out, at 5 p.m. in our day when there is still daylight, we have the greatest muscle strength. That is when our body is most functional when it comes to working with our muscles.
Ta tanda ti te yin specha shapa ne nyongkong chu nga ba kap sim ba na nga so ge ta chi zpo ge ta shadum gi shu che chu ra te chi shi le du ti stambala ya ti kap sa nga so shu ja ta ti ye ni ta chi ba na ko ta jeni shu chen ban dot ko res.
And for example, a little bit after at 7 p.m. when we start getting some, when our day turns to night, we start losing daylight. We have the highest temperature in our body.
Ta pesha shaba na shenda chi ka resa na nga su ta nyama no chi chu dumba la le pe ka su ba na ya nga su zu pu na ge lu ge tra te tu shi res.
So one thing that I welcome all of you to do, even though it won't be an activity, is to maybe keep track of your body temperature throughout different times of the day and see how it fluctuates.
Da da de ya takshe ngi to de gwa de yo ma ya che chu chota de do che go de do chi dum na degree so kare dum na degree se na ani nyima che ke ta de chue de na la ya chi chu zu pu gu de se de lan jiro kana do chi du du se de la ya che chu ge ti chi takshe do chota do na la degrees.
This is yet just like what we did with the pulse and our mental ability with the math. This is yet another way that you could actually visualize the oscillation throughout a 24-hour window when it comes to temperature.
that Mamma Suga Junior Parding Lata Bata Aniko Katizila Ansisi by Nata Budu so by Chibuchi Dubio Ratina Shinga Sugaya Shignala ya ani Shignala is Pug Trace and do Captain do said they can't de young thing at Suge Purilla good at Tankana do the Tana degrees.
And we also know that our changes in our body also responds to different seasons, right? For example, our hair, our hair grows the fastest during the warmer seasons, in the spring and in the summer.
Then I'm thinking I should support in by now, Lupoge, Namdi Shela Yakuya, Lintro Tangsani by now, Mando, speech as an Asu Zupu Gangi, Tangosungo time by Nako, Gian, Joshua Categories, Yakar, what is Namshi Tubo, Bicapseco, Jinjoyores.
The amount of, another example that I can think of is the amount of insulation in our body increases in the winter.
That Zupuna like big insulation system, Balanga Zupuna that you drew near Chiagi, that you trusting Gonis, trusting Guasuguro, that drew Zupuna, the drew near Chiagi to chatting by now, Yanko Gunkagati Sukuchimala do this.
We can also, think about the fact that we may be increasing our insulation because it is winter or because we eat more in the winter, right?
No, that Jim by Narwa. Chichinanga to Gunkatami capsules, Puna, Junior, the Taukin, Chiche by Nayanko, and as to get to chat the Mando, where the Chichinanga to take up the Chicala to the Sayama, Mambosa, and Chichina in cities.
So it could very easily be a combination of something that we are doing to our bodies and also a response to the seasons in the environment.
That is not bad data, Conjuran do about the Chichi by Bana, and Atsuga Zupu, Natsu Karichi, you may take it on Chia in cigarette, Chichi by Bana, and Co. Namdil, Tantani, Corilla, and Jurando, Della Yang, Atsupa, Yalente, or taking it on the cigarettes.
Another thing that we can also think about that we haven't really spoken about in the last 3 days is there a difference between males and females when it comes to our circadian rhythm?
That Kesani Makashlang soon the city Joyo Mare, Simbaina, and Dada Suge Kondi, Tinzun Kondi de la Taba in Banaya, Pumuni Parola, and Capriores.
Oddly enough, when I was making this particular talk for all of you, I tried to research whether there has been a lot of activity in the research between males and females. And what I found interesting is that there is some, not a lot, there is some research pointing to the fact that there may be subtle differences between males and females in how we respond in our circadian clocks. So a little bit of the research that I came across, even though it's limited, it has seen the difference, for example, in hormonal discharge between males and females. But what is also very interesting is that there isn't a lot of research on this. This is still on the very early stages. So we still don't know a lot of the difference between males and females. So much is yet not well understood. Most, I would say, excuse me, I would say that most of the research that we have now is based on men, but we are slowly introducing the idea of been able to decipher the difference between males and females.
anda tande chala nga su taksi paganani man chishi chi pu gongla ya juju taksi chi sa jiju risha simba na nga su tanda ta mititu imba na chi pume gongla ya taksi chi de tande patum pume parola ya kapra kare dundu de tagis.
So for example, we have here some research data looking at differences in melatonin. Now, you all should remember what melatonin does.
De chikare sena nga su ta ko chibato pume na ne melatonin gi chetante kana ro chi me te ne tante tagis ane melatonin sena ne kari image su bita ni gugres.
So we can study the amount of melatonin in males and females in different times of the day throughout the different cycles. And we do have some data that there are some differences, a little bit higher for women. The range is a little bit higher, and men, it tends to be a lot shorter.
ane putong pumege na ya asu melatonin di lebe ge ni tala dus ta bai bai na ko keper dus put pumege na ya pumege na tis mo wa tang ku ge borla chiwa che pug na la ya this nyo wa ti ni tong tang dus.
And this should suggest, for example, that women have a stronger modulation, control, and discharge amount in melatonin versus men.
Da de kare tang gore se na pumege na la ya tanda melatonin di le se te la ya ne ko ge london chia la ya ko ge chunjin de ya go yu patang gore.
We have to remember that this is still on the very early stages. There is still a lot we don't know. And most of the research when it comes to our understanding of melatonin comes from research looking at only men. But now, in the last few years, we are doing a lot better in expanding our knowledge when it comes to differences between men and women. So, for example, here, right, we're looking at a heat wave map, looking at the difference between men and women, men on the left, women on the right, and there's a lot more activity, right, a lot more change within women across the circadian clock.
Pemengna la ya this ma future dus that dig karitengo resena koge dig kapse lebing na la wa tiro da ga suge jegu dan chele chiage ne tan choro ati shicho yo patengo res.
And we also have to understand that the fact that this result may be compounded by the fact that men and women tend to have different occupations within the family.
That day and cook a resena dig timdin in the tomba de young so that you Shuchen Segura, that Shuchen Mampuchi Yam to Depa, taking on it, how part to Poget, that Chile, Segura, the Leka, Gingu, Latinianco, John watching Balaya, Taguris.
So, for example, women, when we have family with kids, women tend to be the caregivers of the children, and they tend to be awake far longer than the men.
That in an Hapertanga Suge Tegeta, Chile Kanzala Yongchak Pioris, or the Picha Shapana Suge, Yan Pumegnani, Chipuguniga, Pamela Tapa in Bana, Ama Chasam by Bana, who get that dick of Simbana, I think I suge, and you sell it on Podech or taking it in Bana, Pugu Chugamatsu in Bana, and you sell it there to Unity Hatchang, according what those.
And when I was making this, some weeks ago, it occurred to me, well, how about different populations of humans? How do different populations differ from each other when it comes to the circadian clock?
Tandagi de Colamson de la Cherson Teddy JB Tantra Kashish Mola Tradichi Capsule, Naranga Samna Karkorson Sena, Ane ko Tandag Dinjungu Konde, Ane Maso 아니 메기 초대 만들고 바로라야 개발 간다로 지연아 사회에서 어텔레송스.
This, of course, brings me to the example of your population, right? Populations that come from very high altitudes, for example, in the Himalayas.
다 디나도 삼로 코알라 텐데 땅가는 그 삼로나 코송세나 다 단다치 춘즈 시진이 제출던데 유주게 아니 그 초대 대삼로 코송스다 첫 번째 제출 아니 사기 사보 투살라 되니게 미리 단다 사버도 히말라야기를 질라 쉬니게 아니 미리 제출 삼로 코송스.
And if we compare populations that tend to be very high versus populations at sea level, we can consider all kinds of different physiological changes, such as the level of oxygen in high altitudes versus sea level.
당아 속에 대가리 삼당레세나 다고 투스 톰볼라 되니게 대당 아니 당아 속에 잔숭에다 투세당다 오이살라 되니게 다 체퍼라 타바인바나 코랑라야 슈신 되니게 첸다 참을 딱규바당로 망포질 딱거다 하버트 다당아 속에 데라 카레타이스나 아니 출롱게다 망로치고로 출롱게 망로게 체들라 타바인스 아니 강라야 사지 투설라야 출롱게 체티스 마오요 바당 네 잔수응을 다 냠바인바나 솔로마요레스.
So when we think of oxygen consumption in high versus low, well, we can think that at high altitudes there is less oxygen, right? So that may have a fundamental ability, change in ability for having the level of brain function.
당아 쪽에 사실 도살라 데이터베인바나 그 솔롱 시스템 보면서 솔롱게 아니 그 솔롱 배치 당하기네 당치로 텔레시션 트랙으로 호텔에 되는데 아니 칼치그레스는 가속에 지금다 솔롱 텔레 되는데 솔롱 뇨뇨 마실래요 말 배치 당하요 말와 호텔에 되는데 아니 가속에 레파게 젤레라야 슈칭 가나도 트랙 두테 타고리스.
So for example, oxygen saturation, how much oxygen is reaching your circulatory system is actually slightly lower, around 88% in populations that are very high, such as those in the Himalayas.
다 대값은 아쪽에다 디스크도가 절롱게다 디체세나 세츄레이션스가 대가스고레서나 아니 다 사체 톰불라 되니다 피치나 히말라야 되니게 메바나 아쪽에 우당비 값이 지라야기 절롱고 디세치고와
And if we compare, for example, populations in the Himalayas with that of Atlanta, where I am, very close to the sea level, right? Well, at sea level, saturation tends to be anywhere from 95 to 100% complete saturation.
다단다 대게 가서 그래. 안가서 다 히말라야기 강라테니기 아니 텔라 요피기 초롱기 디세데다. 아니 단다 피차샤파나 애틀랜타 다올라 트루바인바나 애틀랜타 다다가 수잔수 메다 투세 타뇨여서 네고 디나루 값수 초롱고 디세데 자차 구축공안이 자식 자그 버려레스.
And we can step back and think about, well, this difference in hypoxia, having less oxygen saturation in high altitudes, how does that impact our potential circadian clock in our bodies?
다다다 디가네 가수치 컴바치 치네치데 가수 그 삼도 가리다나 리그레스나 아니 지금 조롱 단 용화요와 사지 도살로 주는 용화요 또 사자 마살라 주롱 그 디체테 마요 바텔라 테네데 내가 저기 딘중 콜로라야 슈진 카너스테기나 세티가 가수 트와타나 디그레스.
And there is a little bit of data suggesting that hypoxia, having less oxygen saturation, does have an impact on our circadian clocks.
다데라야 가수 그 슈진 트레기 바로 조롱티 용화라 텐데 가수게 딘중 콜로라야 슈진 트레기 바게 아니 장투치도 시어레스.
So for example, we could see the oscillations with normal saturation on the top panel and within hypoxia, where even though it's not very apparent, there are subtle differences in how those cycles are working within hypoxic conditions.
당아 속에 persi도 sta 연출로 베타마타마 데이터 바인바나 남진게 조롱고 디세다 다타로 요 픽업스게 아니 진중 콘두긴 조라타 아니 가사 데스 조롱뇨비게 값스게 진중 콜로치고로 되긴 돌라 바인바이나 캐프르시레시레다 민두스 임바이나요 코르니 파르레 캐프르 모용고 두스.
There is evidence that the oscillation, the control, is actually decreased within hypoxic conditions, such as those in the Himalayan populations.
Can you repeat it again? Sorry.
Yeah, so we can also, we can think about the fact that the oscillation, the movement within the day, the variation is lower across hypoxic conditions.
다다나 현대 가서는 아주다 대가서 리서치 거라고 주로 주요하게 리서치 거런데 아니 사체 투위 값을 가서 솔롱 디스 뇨위게 네바블라야 아니 주로 리서치 당단다 대가서다 디치셔야 돼 아니 현대 통들 바이나 디사마도스.
And we can also understand this within the context of heart rate. We all took our pulse, right, in the last couple of days. So we can also understand this within the concept of how our heart rate functions within hypoxic conditions.
디 나신게 계산가 속에 디 년급 paradigm 라 따와와 paradigm 딩체데 간다로 치카요 디 나신게 단단가 속에 아니 디 단나도 거스 년게 딩체데 라 텐데데 아니 가서 가서 그랬다 조롱뇨 위기 네버블라야 고 딜라 쳬파간다도 두요메테 단나도 거스.
So for example, in this lower panel, it's a little bit heavy. Don't worry too much about the details, but understand that the black line with the circles is hypoxic, right? And the line with the white triangles are normal conditions. And there is a variation in heart rate across the different populations. We are across the day, the hours of the day.
다단다 디캅스 양 티리 예쇼로 요피 티르디 바나 코니 체 mambo 직단 요리 바나 양디가 가서 답디오 타바이나 그 틴납부 텐데데 그처 고고 예사데게 가서 다 솔론 뇽위기 고기라 데베기 니미주게 다 디캅스 바나 닝게 딩체르 똑같지 니 셴바티 카르에서나 트다 나고 menju 딱데고 시스템게 따제 주데 바나 솔론 부체데 다다 예사라와 네고 지주들이스 두스타 멤버는 가지고 촌디 만다원 인차게 거기나 따바이나 양 그런 게 가서 그랬다 닝기 등체들 텐데데 양 잡아 용도 있어.
What is also important to know is that the human body is able to adapt. So if I was to move to the Himalayas, for example, my body would adapt to those hypoxic conditions.
다 티네야 앵이 과치가레스나 가서 주보데 고 거기라 텐데 든준두고 있다 게딩아네 히말라야 그리질란 니페데도 수도치고요 바나 가는 게 주고 뭐네 고 솔롱 뇽위 거기 될라야 파튼지치그레스.
So my friends, these basically show us that circadian clocks are complicated. They are under all kinds of influence across seasons, across geography, high altitude, low altitude, temperature, all kinds of different factors.
다 되게 가르쳐고 델라테르데다 가츠게 가링이그레세나 가츠게 주포봉가 딘전 콘드세야 티 하칭가 역타 차우 임바 간실라로 안용적 진실 시스템세 콜라 슈친 트레이닝 바이나양 코 진나 나츠바요 스피차 샤파나 남티리 코 코리 상캄데고 아니 다 사바구 투마투로와 투말라 소파니 데체라 소발라고 진 망포 치키데라 슈친 테그레스.
So for the last few minutes, I want to sort of take us back to our activities that we have done in the last couple of days.
난다 되게 아주 되게 나라야 내가 저 대치다기 인스타 생리고 거진 때라야 데비니만이 장라야 가서게 딱시 지드요 지구 지드요와 되게 걸라야 되듯이인스.
So let's go to our questions that I gave you all yesterday regarding your sleep-wake activity. I'm not talking about the polls or the math. These were the set of questions that we had yesterday. So let's go through them. Let's go to the link, and I'm sure all of you have access to the link. And let's see what people wrote. And I'm going to ask different groups to perhaps share their responses. So let's go ahead and go to our questions. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second here.
나가 수대다기 있어 계산할 수가 있다 지금 데이터 저 같이 당요레스티 안단다 지금 연구 활동 다야당 되는 말에 신다 같이 당요레스티 라야 저 데이터 렌트야 지수도스 렌트샤도스 당아수 데이터데 ne yang rukha kha chungone susu ge yang ko Twitter kari chongmang ko la ya ani keche share ko is.
So let's go to our link and let's see what people have. So we can go to day 4, activity 2.
Ta ni ma shua ge che go ni ba de la ro. Ada man che chula ya ta link chi ge la stance wa de kesa che che ra che chu ge te nga ta ba ina yores.
So I don't see anybody. I don't see any answered questions here, but perhaps people did it in their notes or their books. If anybody wants to, yeah, I don't think anyone answered the questions via the Google Sheet, and that's okay. Did anyone answer the sheets on paper or anywhere else beyond the Google Sheet?
Anda Google gala ta pa bana Google ge ko te gala ya sho de gala ya chi su ge len di zhi jie min du shi wa ma chi su ge yang pa su su ge de ta ya na sho gala ge ni gu ge zhi ju den da yo es da yo ba na su su de shi na de res.
Anyone? Did anyone do the assignment? Anybody do the homework?
Je gu chi te sa chi su la ro je gu chi te knowledge te sa de ji yu ni yo es. You said day 4 activity 2, right?
Yes, day 4, activity 2. We have a bunch of different questions. So they were supposed to go to bed an hour at a different time. I was asking, what time do you normally go to bed? This was the last assignment from yesterday, from Saturday's class.
За бэмбагийн зэтраге капсги ани жигу таматрис токаштуа катинье имбесала сопага токаштуа терес.
So I'm wondering if anybody actually happened to do it.
Aha, karisangute sena chetseti jiara joins jimbes. Yeah, one hand up.
Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, so I'll be happy to hear from anyone that happened to
더
do.
진짜 디 뮤트 알레다 뮤트 온 체스 온 당기네 디가도 근데 therefore activity 2 라이디 제도와 망착 디 통갱 가래 통면이나
All right. He said they already did the activity day for activity 2, and they're wondering maybe you are not seeing the answers on your Google Doc.
디르와 technology 디저 토잡라이스도 디르와 트와데
Where do you have the answer?
디 인사마레
Day for activity 2, let's
Yeah, let me share my screen so you can see what I'm looking
yeah,
at.
that's better. That's better.
Yeah, right. So I'm looking at this one right here, the sleep-wake cycle experiment. And a lot of you are in this room right now, but I don't see any answers. They're all identical to each other.
Those those de la mampochi de gonna ta de do imba na yang ko lenjamen those.
Miguel,
Yes, sir.
yeah, morning actually we were busy with pulse and this one wake activity. Regarding the pulse and wake activity, we were making graph and all those things.
Oh, so okay, that was a different assignment. This was a different activity that they had to do overnight, yeah, from yesterday to today, right? So perhaps they missed it, and that's okay. That's okay. You know, we can certainly still go through a lot of these questions, and perhaps the students got confused as to which activity they were doing each night, and that's perfectly fine too.
Teaching nga ta kesan che suppose ta chorwa o tege thank you so much wando ta yana chu kasugre kasu ma jhatena do english ta tanda ga su to kashita against the day imba na tanda ga takshi chia chorwa takshi dribya de ani ko gonda drugwa chirda overnight system bala ya ta ning gonda ni sani shoba karte ye
Yeah, in the next session after our break, in an hour, we're going to do the graphs for our pulse and our math brain activity. But that's okay. We can still tackle a lot of these questions and just having sort of a discussion with our scholars on what time do they normally go to bed, what conditions do they normally go to bed in. So that's okay if we don't have any responses for this particular type of experiment. That's perfectly fine.
That machine ko nandam de chomindu se ne ta nga chun chotan ni ba te kap sin ba nga chu ge ti chi che chu ta shi chi rio ro ma chu ge ti ning gi par che yang ge ding che de ta shi chi ju ti la ya de da ane kar sa ji ge zi ji ga chi ro de ta de o chu ge ta shi chi ju ti ane de la nga chu kan ya kap su de chi chi de te ne thri la pa ba chi ro de ta ta gi yes.
So, for example, for the first question that we can all see here, right? During the day, and this we can just think about our daily activity when we're walking or we're outside. What animals do we observe, and do they have any type of cyclic rhythm? And anybody can answer this.
Da da nga su te tu de chi de tong lan de ani se su khat ga dus je ne ti du sta tang po de ba na nga su ta ni ma gi ni mu gi ti su chi chu ya ma pe pick up sin ba na ani che zu ge ji so cha tong sem jin xian da de na ka ri tong so ne ko se la ya yang ka se da de de do ge ani gi ro ani gi ko chu de na ro da kon de da ani ni jin de do mu do.
Anyone? Just by thinking about what we see, the animals that we see, perhaps dogs or cats. I know there are some dogs in the monastery. I remember them. Do we notice any kind of circadian rhythm within those types of animals?
Danga tsuki ta ya ne shimi na ro ngara ba na chi gomba yen to la ki de na tong su. Yin ba na ya ko so la chi jin jung ko ndo ro de da es.
아니 당연히 가서 추전이 단 제가 되어질라 nga pe get chinde pe kijinga jinyal de shas.
What was that?
It mentioned that around 2 in the afternoon he just went around the monastery, and around the gate he saw like 5-6 dogs are taking naps.
Yes, I actually remember that very well too when I was walking around, right? So yes, we can certainly visualize this and we see it all the time. So let me ask the group, what time do normally all of you go to sleep? And a lot of people can answer, just to get an idea of when people go to sleep.
11 and 12.
11
p.m.
11. Okay. Anyone else?
12:30.
12:30. Wow, you guys go to bed late.
Yeah.
10:30.
10:30, a little bit earlier. Okay. So, we have a range a little bit earlier, 10:30, and some people go to bed after midnight. And that's, I would expect to see that, right? And anyone, we can sort of modify our questions to just a discussion. If you needed to go to bed early, do you normally, are you able to go to bed earlier if you need to? And what do you do to go to bed earlier?
Hello.
Yes.
I used to try it when there was specials at the morning. I try to change my routines, but it's a little bit difficult to sleep, although I try to sleep earlier.
Okay. And were you able to sleep, excuse me, were you able to sleep earlier?
Yeah, I try, but it is difficult to fall asleep.
And what do you do to fall asleep earlier? What kinds of or techniques do you use to sleep earlier?
There's no any special, but I try to sleep earlier only.
Okay, okay. Anyone else got to sleep earlier, and perhaps you want to share or techniques that would let you go to sleep earlier than you normally do?
다 셴바데 요나 스탠다 게라 소아데로와 아니 kushula soyate ko shopala lika tondo kechembatene bana gomo ngautis nyegi yesimbana ye khabuchi dus tatila tablen kanda do tengesne tablen muse tenda tengemes instambala ye tanda ne gela gi dot jete ne karesena chesu shenda tenda yona swa gonda tis ngawala nye chen ane ko ani khuya gi chetu ko tablen ta ji je gusuguro da tablen mando de yang tablen tinda moto chinye yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Also, I'm very like early. I'm very kind of person. I have to go bed very early. So sometimes it's really hard to fall in sleep. So at that time is what I'm thinking is the best way to try to sleep is to meditate, like especially the single point meditation. So it's helped a lot because it's usually like closing all the, so many kind of thinking. And sometimes it's really helpful if you like use air condition and make your body a little bit like cold. And then it also helps to get sleep faster.
Excellent, thank you.
Tanda ta ngai ba na shop ta karso gonda de sangau nye ge tya la de sia ko do is wada tanda ko nye stambala ya chirgi na khabuchi du sta khabuchi ka su tabla no kan no tang ge sena ne gom jag is gom in ba na thapat de shine gi gom tangin jung gom ya chor wa shine gi gom ja ba na ji samlu yang lu ya gu kan za jap chi de ko ni khwa la peng du sia chenda chi ba na chang lo dang ba na ro se chang lo dang ba na ni na sa ni la peng du.
Going back to the topic of meditation, I find that very, very interesting because even though I am nowhere near your level of understanding how to meditate, for example, in judo, we also do a little bit of meditation.
Ta chechu tang dar ba na chirgi chi ma so gom jaga ge ti zu che tumbal he umare simbana ya ku che ba na dan da gela na juru si go ro juru tang te ba na ko ya ku gom du tang ba na ti peng dus.
And in the moments that I do meditate, I feel this state of calmness, almost like a sleepy state of mind, where I'm very close to falling asleep.
Ta dan da de kap simbana gom ina do jab kap simbana ni tang de kap se chi pe thele cha du ta thele cha ba de chi ga ni khwa da mar da imbana chi ga ni khu dra ge ne ba do chorwa o tin da so le dus.
So I can certainly relate how meditation can help us go to sleep a little bit earlier.
Handa de stambala ya tela tene de te jimsin de la tene de te ane ko gum ja ba na yang chi ga ni ngawa khwa la peng du sa te la ya ane ngarange jawa ti tut kudus.
So we established that all of you go to bed a little bit earlier, a little bit later. Let's say 10 would be like an earlier time, 12:30, maybe 1 would be a later time.
Da nga suim ba na chichu ta nye gi chichu te chi ta chi ko produce ta this nga o nye ni ba na chichu chu che ka lu nye che ane chu nye ni ba na chichu chu ni tang tang po la nye ga lu te dus.
And now let me ask all of you, what time do you normally wake up?
Ta shenda chi ka chi se ba na twa te ka la na chichu shopa ni namjin chichu ka chu chi le segi yu sa ti twa te yes.
And anyone, maybe a few of you can answer.
Sugala jana degrees.
6 a.m.
6 a.m. And what time do you go to bed if you wake up at 6 a.m.?
Topat tanda de gela tupalang golag tupala langi yo pana gonda ma ka tu nyegi yesa
11 p.m.
11 p.m. So you go to bed 11, wake up at 6. Okay, good. 7 hours. Excellent. Anyone else?
ngal tes kheba du ya
sonda
chudu chegal nye suna shida chegas la ni segdu ta 중니 당보스 데 심스나 투버스 마다 니 segment
enchina son shandi wa
in my case it depends if I sleep earlier maybe 10:30 I normally wake up at 4:30 in the morning.
Wow, that's early.
And then, and then if I sleep very late, maybe I sleep around 12 midnight or sometimes 1 a.m. Then at the earliest I'll get up at 6. So
wow.
In my case, I didn't, I was not able to sleep beyond 7.
Right. Yeah. You're like me. I tend to, go to bed around midnight and I wake up at 6. So I usually do not sleep more than 6 hours.
근데 더우레샤스 나이 마나 남진 저 산다 공연을 nye 바이나 아니 두발을 사용도 스타 남진 바나 저 둘을 하발아야 아니 코니 쿠통도스.
And that's very interesting because I could go weeks sleeping anywhere from 5 to 6 hours, but every so many weeks there is one day that I just get really, really tired and my body has to catch up.
I'm bana namjin bana chigo karsugeta dunto kashila chite ta ngani tu dinanye ane tik jela ya san sama zuko hajan kale kats tambalaya ane ko ta chi karsugeta ane tik kasep je de yang ti ni ti yang kap chila ya ni tis ma kuba ni tantinam gudus.
And of course, if we sleep, if we think about our sleep cycle, we don't go to bed the same time across the different seasons, or at least in places where the seasons are very pronounced.
Tanga so dela ya chige se tang nye gi chige kolu de ta bai bai na thapur tu ane kasugre sachamando ta thapur tu sachamando la ya machu namti shi gi jirwati shu chenbo yosa la ya ane ko nye tang la ya gi chu parola yang ko kasugre namti shi gi munsu do bo yosa ne tang ta bai bai na yang ko senyu gi nye gi chu de la ya chapandu res.
What happens to me normally is when it gets really cold in the winter, I don't want to get up very early. So, we can think about the fact that our rhythm can also be heavily influenced by the environment, by the seasons, and how our environment is changing all the time.
That is namtila tenedeti ane katrim bana yan juan du yapatila ngina degrees.
So yeah, okay, it's okay if we didn't go through these questions, that's perfectly fine. Again, after our break, we'll discuss our graphs. And at this point, let me go back to my PowerPoint for 1 second here. Are there any questions from anything that we've seen today or earlier?
Tanda ane kasa chuton jema kala yarwa soje person jela nga suge ane thirje tang tula tagins jebu tang rewe ane shenda de tanda bata nga suge ki tisha ji chorwa de tang rewe jwa de na yenas.
Anyone? No questions. All right, so we still have a couple of minutes that we can just have either questions or what I do want after our half-an-hour break is for us to, we're going to have a review, and I'm going to actually quiz you all on different cycles. So start thinking on your mind how you define the cycles and what type of activities do we see around our natural planet? And you have to be able to decipher them.
Da nga so soja barsang chela nga tise do tila ta pang me si ba na yang se su ge kondu se ge tira do tise jang sta ba la ya ne tang kan do chi la ten de tise ja ge yo me ta ane ko kar su khri ma do la ek kan kan do chi yo me ge ne ta te ko la ya ni se song tang look like someone has question.
Yes, question. Perfect.
더 저거지요. 단다디 답변은 ngazo tingsa mi mancha chenle chinye yorwa. Dile kongle chenle night shift chinye. Dizole ya ko ta chik karso re wo go jo da direct thone cheba so go yorwa. Chazang konzo di tunzi ko do yuwa do ya da direct jembe ya chik jiong chane so bo de da dizole gyon ro go yobe direct nezu ke yorwes.
His question is about who works at night shift for night shift. Is there any health consequences because of the night shift?
Absolutely, there can be, right? Our body can only adapt for so long. And yes, if you have a job where you work at night, at least in the beginning, you can get used to it. But you're essentially going against the natural cycle, right? So eventually, just like after a few weeks, my body just gets really tired and I need to sleep. There comes a point in time where your body will have to adjust. And there can be some, consequences to this.
도쇼 기타 지금 요타기 지고와 니스탄발라야 나수 zupola 칼리카데 데 나지 참치라 칼리슈 카던 참치라야 니쿤슈 투아 호텔라텐데 데 야고 준랑볼라 제바인바나 양고 트레팅 테네 슈진 덴데 용그레 상기스.
And even beyond the disrupting our cycle, at night, if we're working at night and we sleep during the day, we're not exposed to as much sunlight and we're not getting vitamin D. So we are disrupting a lot of things in our bodies if we decide to work at night.
That chitang so get ko kondite la ya shuchen tegiores ni bana senda kon lekache nima kon yego stambala nga sule zupula ya ni nimani raegi ane vitamin suji dre rago yomares suji dre rago mes stambala ya ko nga so kondite la ya chenchwa samaimba nga su zupula gwege ko mampuchi ya dusrat ke yomares.
So people that do work at night, they may have to take supplements in pills to get those vitamins that they normally do not get during the day.
That is tambalaya chanda kon chale chini baina ko su nimag tips ane ko rag me chu suchi tu khaneng che che to ne suchi khaneng mendila yo wa mo tu yon sago ke gres.
But that's a very, very good question, my friend. Thank you for the question.
Jo ha chan ya budus tuji che.
Good. So let's go ahead and I always put lunch break, but that's for me. So let's go ahead and let's take a little bit of a break. We'll come back at 11 my time, and we'll go through our next round of topics. We'll have a little quiz. I'll ask you all to identify the different cycles, and we'll review. I'm really looking forward to seeing your graphs and explain to me what you found out about your bodies when it comes to the pulse rate and your brain activity.
Da nyongong shela tshayes nyongong shechu mares ngara imbane nyongong ke khala te insra te chela nga so ni twa tlan che ta tsich ta